this is, I mean, I'll talk about it. I'm doing a variety of things in retirement. I'm doing volunteering for 12 organizations that work with kids who are in various forms of trouble, and I actually got involved in a couple of business ventures, which is not what I planned to do, but seems so far.
Retirement is fun.
I work with 2 different organizations that try to help poor people whose health is really compromised by poor diet or whatever. I teach cooking, and because people don't know how to boil water just about.
Really?
Yeah. And they need to take care of themselves, and they need to understand that no one's going to do it for them. They have to have the information.
Because look, there are so
But
many
it's very hard to get the people who need it the most, are in such a kind of depressed state that they can't even get to the point where they realize, this is going to be good
so
for
I will
me.
come back and let you know, because when this is through, I'll start taking classes again. How they do the connection. I'm the other organization that runs this has been around for 160 years. It's one of these illustrious old nonprofits in New York. I don't know. But by the way, you left out not know how to cook. I remember 24 years ago, I know exactly because I'm not told my young stories. My wife was exhausted. She was giving birth to a kid. And I said, I'm going to make Chinese lemon chicken. I was in the middle of a very, several $100 million bond deal for somebody. I was not fazed at all by this bond deal, but I was terrified. I was like, kids, come on, there's got to be more to this. What does mom do now? I was like, my son is like 10. I think, how do I help you out that much to have it?
Yeah, because the truth is you can't get it from a cookbook. You have to understand what you're doing. You have to understand some things if you put a cover on it versus if you don't put a cover. And what's the most economical way to cook it in terms of time and nutrition.
Do you love cooking? Is this a hobby of yours?
Yeah, I've been cooking forever. I cook my eyes closed. So I thought, to me, it's so easy. I would like to, explain that to people. That that you don't have to, when they see lists of ingredients, they get all nervous, and how it's not that intimidating if you know what you're doing.
What you're saying was, you're also getting another very important point: is the confidence to do things. I mean, I'm coaching a kid right now at Year Up. He's very smart. He writes better than I write. He's a good guy. He's got no confidence. He knows middle class social skills.
Right. That's it.
So what he needs is. Yes, he's developing technical skills in the program, but a lot of it, okay, Shmo, I've written you an email about you dinner. You cannot not respond. I'll put up with that. But if you do this in a business context and you don't respond to somebody, and then I get this very apologetic emails, I'm so terribly busy. I said, Tom, I'm not going to say you should criticize me for it. I'm not going to say you better internalize this idea that when somebody reaches out to you, you got me. But, I look at the kind of social background my kids have, the kind of social skills they have, even the least social skills of my kids.
Oh, it's a different world.
It's a very different world.
It's a different world. And it really annoys me because there's so many, you get the feeling that people are, all these community efforts, well, they're not dealing with it. And it's not, and no one is going to be able to be raised up to another level until you deal with some of the stuff that no one's addressing. And it's social skills like responding when someone says, if nobody likes to say it, I notice, I don't know. So they'll either not answer or make up an answer. It's so.
Look, I did a class last week where I taught at CUNY for a bunch of PhD students. These are the kids who are presumably bright. They didn't know the basics. How do you dress for a job?
Yeah.
If you go into this kind of company, you look differently than you go to that kind of company. What are they looking for? Solving their problem. I mean, these social things that are, so you can throw all the money you want at schools and you can pay teachers better. That's. I mean, obviously you don't want to have bad schools, but the issue is more fundamental.
Yeah.
So was this something you did professionally, or what did you do? What's your professional interest?
No, I used to be a graphic artist at one time. I did medical research at one time. I mean, I'm old, I've done a million things.
That's great.
But,
it's neat.
yeah, it's just, There's so much to do. There's so much to do to make this a better place.
That's part of competing trees, we're part of God to make it a better world.
But it's amazing how they don't realize that people,
I'm sorry?
that people don't have the basic skills, like.
Yeah.
Look, I can bring you one.
Okay,
Yeah.
we are here.
Yes.
That's for later, I just have.
Some of us.
The most did.
Right? Tomorrow night, we have this program on food, hunger. I urge everybody to come and bring a lot of people with you. We have a speaker coming from New Mexico, very interesting guy. He's an expert on food systems in the United States, food insecurity, systemic issues, not about particularly doing this and that, but he deals with the big issues. I think it's very important. Okay, now, Parshat HaShavua. This week's Parsha is Terumah. So we begin the Mishkan, sections on the Mishkan. Before we get to that, some thoughts about last week, which is not about the Parsha, but about the Haftorah. Last week's Haftorah, last week was called Shabbat Shkolim. Last week is, so there are 4 special Torah readings that we have during the year, which are highlighted in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is actually Mishnah in Masechet Megillah. Masechet Megillah is about the Megillah. But the truth of the matter is when you open up a tractate Megillah and you read the Mishnah, there are 33 Mishnayot in Masechet Megillah. A very small percentage of them talk about Megillah, and virtually none of them talk about Purim outside of the Megillah. In fact, it's very striking that when you read Masechet Megillah, the Mishnah never mentions, for example, ever Mishloach Manot. It's never mentioned in the Mishnah. It mentions Matanot Levyonim in passing once or twice, in passing in the conjunction of the Megillah, but never discusses the mitzvahs. It talks about the reading of the Megillah, which he calls the Megillah. The word Megillah was never used in the Megillah for the Megillah. The Megillah never called itself a Megillah. It called itself a Sefer, perhaps, or an Igeret, but it never refers to itself as a Megillah. That itself is interesting. Actually, there are many interesting questions. But the tractate actually deals with reading the Megillah in a very interesting way, an odd way. But then, the second half of the tractate deals with a brief set of Mishnayot about the sanctity of the Beit HaKnesset, holy spaces, and various levels of sanctities. Beit Knesset, place set aside for prayer or Torah reading. Then it deals with the sanctity of the Torah and the things that cover the Torah, and etc. And then it deals a lot with one of the 3 main themes is the Torah readings for the year. So it's very curious, actually. I'm moving into Purim next time of year now. I think Thursday is the first day of Adar. Was that when you read Tractate Megillah, you get the impression that the most fundamental Torah reading that we have is the reading of the Megillah, which is completely contradictory to what we see in the Babylonian Talmud. Babylonian Talmud when it talks about Torah readings in general, talks about it ascribes the practice of Torah reading to two people. That is to say, public reading of the Torah is described in the Talmud Bavli essentially to 2 people who made, one might say, rabbinic enactments of sorts. The first was Moshe. It's one person. And the second is Ezra the scribe. Those are the 2 people that the Bavli speaks of in terms of setting up the Torah readings. Torah reading on Mondays and Thursdays, Shabbos afternoon, Torah readings on the festivals. But Megillah was never mentioned at all. In fact, the Babylonian Talmud, not the Mishnah, but the Babylonian Talmud, cited in Tractate Megillah, raises the question, sounds like, as to what says whether Esther, according to one view, Esther is not Matame Yadayim. If you're familiar with this whole discussion, the rabbis decree that the holy books, if you touch them, your hands become unclean, for whatever purpose it was. So, Tumat Yadayim, if you touch the Sefer Torah, your hands become unclean. It's called a certain kind of tumah. Tumah is yadayim. So you have netilat yadayim because your hands are impure. Tomorrow's discussion is whether Esther is Matame et hayadayim, whether the scroll of Esther is Matame et hayadayim or not. Now, what that seems to be, what it's related to, is whether Esther is considered to have a certain kedusha. In other words, the things that are Matame yadayim are writings that we say have a certain kedusha to them, a certain sanctity. So Sefer Torah has a sanctity. That's why, for example, you can't just sell it arbitrarily. You have to treat it a certain way. The other books of the Bible have a certain sanctity, not as great as the Torah, but they have also a sanctity. Even things that the Torah cover, say the Torah scroll, you cover it with something, has a certain sanctity to it. The adornments of the Torah, all that. The ark, because it houses the Torah, has a certain sanctity to it. So, question, what about the scroll of Esther? What about the Megillah? So the Gemara didn't say it has sanctity, the Gemara says it's Matame et hayadayim. It's related to that question. Now elsewhere, the Gemara raises the question about, the Mishnah raises the question about different other books. It raised the question about Kohelet. It raised the question about Shir HaShirim. It raised the question about Yecheskel. Many things in Yecheskel seem to contradict the Torah. The Mishnah, as far as I could find, never discussed it about Esther, but the Gemara cites other Tanaitic sources that debate whether Esther is Matame et hayadayim. Now, what's interesting is that on one hand, the Talmud discusses whether Esther is Matame et hayadayim, but the Mishnah sees the scroll of Esther as your core reading, which is very interesting. It's not necessarily a straight-out contradiction, but it is a curious combination of two factors, two possibilities. Okay, we follow the view that Esther is Matame et hayadayim. My point is, when you read Tractate Megillah, it's obvious that what the tractate is about, it's about reading sacred text publicly. And the core sacred text to be read publicly is the Megillah, and the other stuff in the Mishnah, it seems to be based on the Megillah. Megillah is the paradigm. Now, why would the Megillah be a paradigm for Torah reading? Why that's such an odd. So if you think about it, probably if you want to give a reason for this, why of all things the Megillah would be the paradigm. One could make the argument, some certainly have made this argument, that specifically because the Megillah is so problematic, there's a book without God's name. Let's start with that. The book seems to be a sort of a comedy, off-color comedy. No God mentioned, no land of Israel mentioned, no temple mentioned. That Dafka, the rabbis, in response to that, are saying, no, and not only is it not a secular work, on the contrary, it's the most central work to be read. That's an argument some people like to advance. It's not my own cup of tea, but that's some people like to advance that argument. I would go in a different direction, and I would say that probably the reason that the Megillah is presented as the core reading is because within the Megillah, it's actually all very relevant to Parshat HaShavua. Actually, nothing could be more relevant than this, because the Megillah contains within it something else. And that is when you read the Megillah, read it carefully, you see that the Megillah makes many, many references to the story of Amalek. Haman himself, though the Megillah never uses the word Amalek, Haman is obviously related to Amalek in the sense that he's the Agagite, he's the Agagi, and Agag is the king of Amalek who fights against Shaul. So when it comes to Amalek, that's the first time we ever have in the Chumash the idea of writing something down. God said to Moshe, "Katov zot zikaron b'sefer v'sim b'yoznei Yoshua." God said, "Write this down in a book and tell Yoshua that I will destroy Amalek from under the heavens." So there you have the idea of writing something down, right? As a zikaron, as a remembrance. So writing down as a remembrance segues very easily into reading it in order to remember. So therefore we have, for example, not this past Shabbat, was Shabbat Shkalim, but the Shabbat before Purim is the second of the 4 special readings mentioned in the Mishnah Megillah called Parshat Zachar. Parshat Zachar, we read the verses not in Shemot, but the verses in Dvarim, 3 verses to remember what Amalek did when you left Egypt and to destroy Amalek from under the heavens. Do not forget. So we are remembering Amalek. How do we remember Amalek? By reading the Torah. So the truth of the matter is, that's one way to remember Amalek, by reading the Torah. But there might be another way to remember Amalek also by reading something else, and that is by reading the Megillat Esther. Megillat Esther actually is a story about Amalek, and not surprisingly, when you read the Megillah and you get towards the end of the Megillah, suddenly you encounter something very interesting in the Megillah, which is the language that's found in the Torah about Amalek, namely, write this down as a memory in the book, and then the text ends, a war against Amalek in every generation. That's how the Torah describes it in Sefer Shemot. You have exactly those terms at the end of Megillat Esther. That it's written down, these days are remembered and performed, Nizkarim, right? Esther wrote it down by Sefer, and these days are Nizkarim v'nasim b'chol dar v'dar in every generation. So the Megillah makes almost virtually explicit reference to Amalek. So therefore, the Megillah is a book dedicated to the idea of remembering Amalek and destroying Amalek. And since remembering and destroying Amalek is the first thing that's ever written in the Torah, and not only is it written in the Torah, but God instructed Moshe to write it as a memory, as a remembrance. It sounds like you have to remember it through the writing. And not only that, God instructed Yoshua, Moshe, to tell Yoshua, Ketov zod zikaron b'sefer, the symbios ne Yoshua. So the question is, what is symbios ne Yoshua? I was thinking about this over the weekend. What does it mean? Write this down as a memory in a book, the symbios ne Yoshua, and put it into Yoshua's ears. Tell Yoshua. Of course, Yoshua is the general of the army. So he's the person who's going to fight the wars. He fights the first war against Amalek. So in other words, God says, I have a war against Amalek, but I want you to fight my war for me. Fight this holy war against Amalek, and you are to write it down in a book, and you are to tell Yoshua. And I was thinking something else, which is very curious, because I'm fixated on the Megillah now. I was looking at the Mishnayot in Masechet Megillah. It's very interesting to study the Mishnah, first of all. Most people don't study Mishnah as Mishnah. Some people never see a Mishnah in their lives, tragically. Some people do, who learn a lot. They read the Mishnah, but they read the Mishnah as a preface to studying Gemara. That's the way most people are taught. The Mishnah is the introduction to the study of the Talmud. What people, generally speaking, excluding academics, what they don't do is look at the Mishnah as a work unto itself. There has been, over the last several years, I would say, a big push to look at the Mishnah as a work unto itself. Actually, the guy who spearheaded this in the world, that is the study of Mishnah as a kind of literary work unto itself, is actually my brother-in-law. His name is Avi Wallfish, and he put this on the map in Israel. He has many pupils. It's very interesting. It's on the Jewish website. You can see some of this stuff. It's quite interesting. There is a book which came out a few years ago by this guy Hanan Gafni, son of Shai Gafni, called Pshuto Shel Mishnah, which is actually also a very interesting book. And he talks about the history of studying Mishnah, and at what point during basically the 18th century, he discusses in terms of the 18th century, in terms of Haskalah, the Enlightenment and all that, the sense that among certain groups of people, should the Mishnah be understood in its own right, or should the Mishnah only be understood in terms of what the Gemara says about the Mishnah? He made the interesting argument there, among other things, that one of the chief proponents of the idea that the Mishnah has its own validity apart from what the Talmud says it means. That is to say that what it might plausibly mean is different from what the Gemara says it means. Which, by the way, when you study in the world of academia, and I think in general, it's obviously so. It's obviously true. But that's when I grew up that was totally unacceptable. But the one who actually, he argues, is one of the main people the proponents for this, is none other than the Vilna Gaon. that the Gaon actually believed clearly that the Mishnah has its own validity, apart from what the Gemara says it means. There actually is other evidence there is good evidence that this is the case. I mentioned all this because I was thinking in terms of Torah readings and the 4 Parshiot, which we're in the middle of now. When you read the Mishnah and Megillah, what's obvious is that the 4 Parshiot, we started last week with the first one, are the core readings of the year. That's obvious. They're exceptional. The other readings are either you're reading the Torah week by week, or you're reading readings which are related to the various festivals. But the idea of the Dalet Parshiot, that's something unusual. It's so unusual. It stands out. It's not reading on a festival. It's reading on a Shabbat, a special reading on Shabbat. It's not clear at all. The Talmud debates whether those readings were the only reading on Shabbat, or whether they were in addition to. Nowadays, it's in addition to. But that's not clear at all. Gemara debates it, and it's pretty clear. It would appear that they were instead of. In any event, so what are the 4? What are these 4 readings? So the first one is Zachar, is Shkolim, as we read last week. I want to discuss that in a minute. And before Purim, you read Parshat Zachar. Those are 2. Then it says after Purim, you read Parshat Parah. You read the Parsha of the Parah Aduma. And on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, or thereabouts, you read Parshat HaChodesh, which is the Korban Pesach. So what's curious is that 2 of the 4 obviously are identified with 2 special days on the calendar. Parshat Zachar is obviously related to Purim, just to remember Amalek. You read that before Purim. And the last one, Parshat HaChodesh, is read just around the Chodesh Nisan, which is related, obviously, to Pesach. You read about the Korban Pesach. The question is the other 2. The question is Shkolim and Para. What are they actually about? Before I get to that, I want to mention something that I thought was very interesting about the Mishnah and Masechet Megillah. And most of you maybe have not read through the Mishnayot in Masechet Megillah. They're 4 chapters long. And they have certain themes, and you look at it as a distinct work in and of itself, certain things that are very curious. And here's one of the curious features of it, and actually many things are curious when you begin to look at it. The first Mishnah, Masechet Megillah, the first 2 or 3 Mishnayot discuss when does one read Megillat Esther. So the Mishnah makes the following claim, that the Megillah can be read on 5 different days. 5 different days. And that 5 distinct days. One is the day we call Purim, which is the 14th day of the month of Adar, the 12th month. That, it says, is for Jews who live in cities that don't have walls around them. But for cities that have walls around them, they read on the 15th day. Nowadays we call that Shushan Purim. But one second. Why is that? It's an excellent question. Why it is? Now, before I get to why it is, I want to make a different point. The Mishnah says, what constitutes a walled city? What is a walled city? I don't mean what constitutes a walled city in terms of how big the wall's got to be. That's a separate discussion in the Talmud. But walled from what point? Now, when you read the Megillah, let me just back up a second. When you read the Megillah, which we do in 2 weeks, so this is that. When you read the Megillah, the 9th chapter of the Megillah describes how Purim comes to be a holiday. In that chapter, which is an important chapter, it's an unusual chapter, it says the following, that the Jews, it says, who fought on the 13th day of the month and rested on the 14th day of the month, on the day they rested, they made a party, and a big party. And then the Megillah says, therefore, Hayudim ha-prazim hayoshvim b'yarei ha-prazot, the Jews who are prazim, who live in the cities which are prazot. So what does that mean? Those Jews keep the 14th day of Adar every year as a holiday. What does it mean, prazim and prazot, arei ha-prazot? So the Gemara, the Mishnah, understands it in the following way. Therefore, the Jews who live in prazim, who are scattered, that is to say, who live in cities which are prazot, which they take to mean cities which have no walls. Now that distinction, calling up a city which is Paruz is a city that has no wall, there is a basis for that in the Tanakh. There's a verse that distinguishes a walled city from a city which is Paruz, which is sort of an open city. It's not that what the Megillah means is a very good question. That's the rabbinic understanding of it. I say understanding of it, whether they actually understand it that way or they choose to make that interpretation for their own reasons is a separate question. Personally, I don't think that's the pshat, actually. In terms of the most plausible reading, I don't believe that's true. But then Mordechai sent another letter, and Mordechai's letter says that the Jews who lived in a different city, they also should have a holiday, and they should observe, maybe everybody should observe 2 days of Purim, the 14th and the 15th. The city in the Megillah that is an exception to the rule, the city that is fighting still on the 14th, is what city? Shushan. Remember, the king goes to Esther and says, the Jews killed 500 people in the capital city of Shushan. What do you want, Esther? Esther said, give the Jews in Shushan another day to fight. So the Jews in Shushan fight another day. And they rested on the 15th. So when you read the Megillah, what it sounds like is there's two groups of people. There's the world, all Jews, every place. They observed the 14th of Adar, or observed it. And then there's the Jews in the city of Shushan, and the Mordechai sends his letters to everybody. You should also observe the 15th day. The Gemara's understanding, by the way, is that you observe one day or the other, not that you observe both. When you read the Megillah, though, pay attention this year, you'll see it's not clear. It sounds more like everybody observes 2 days, but doesn't matter. Let's leave it with the Gemara's understanding. But the distinction in the Megillah, obviously, is between the city of Shushan and all the other cities. The only city that's mentioned is Shushan. And the Gemara, and the idea that Shushan had a wall makes sense, since it's the capital city. But that's not what the Mishnah says in Megillah. The Mishnah in Megillah says a different thing. When do you read the Megillah? When does the Megillah? Megillah is read on the following days. The 14th, on the 15th, and that's 3 more days. Which cities read on the 15th day? What we call Shushan Purim. What cities read on Shushan Purim? Any city that had a wall around it, and then the Mishnah adds, from the time of, do you know this stuff? Time of Yoshua ben Nun. The Mishnah makes the unbelievable claim that the definition, or actually makes 2 claims. One is that there's a distinction between walled and unwalled. Okay, maybe it's true, maybe not, in terms of the pshat. But then it added something else, that the determinant factor as to whether you read the Megillah on the 14th or the 15th is whether it had a wall around it from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. Not Shushan. Shushan is not mentioned at all. The Mishnah takes the whole, first, actually creates this distinction, and then the Mishnah says, and the threshold point in time is the time of Yoshua ben Nun. So the Talmud already says, what is this in Yoshua ben Nun? So Yoshua ben Nun, to give honor to the land of Israel. That's why Jerusalem reads on the 15th. I mean, Shushan Purim, the main city that stands out nowadays, that observes Purim on a different day, is the city of Yerushalayim, which has a wall around it, had a wall around it. It doesn't have one today. It had a wall around it at the time of Yoshua ben Nun. That's the claim. And any city that had a wall around it at the time of Yoshua, but even if it doesn't have a wall anymore, doesn't matter. As long as the time of Yoshua ben Nun there's a wall.
So they didn't have to build it. As
long as it has a wall at that point in time. But what's interesting, actually, is many things interesting here. One of the interesting features is the Megillah begins, the first words out of the Megillah, suddenly we have incorporated Yoshua ben Nun into Megillat Esther. I mean, this is like, boggles the mind. Now, it's not that surprising, because on one hand, Yoshua ben Nun is the first person singled out who's supposed to fight Amalek. Write this down in a book, and Symbios ne Yoshua. Since Yoshua is the general who fights Amalek, it's not that surprising that the Mishnah brings him in there. Obviously, one could make the argument, many have made it, I actually think it's true, that the Mishnah is actually bothered by Purim altogether. Purim actually bothers the Mishnah for the simple reason that what kind of holiday is Purim? It's a holiday of Jews. It's a holiday for Jews who live in Golos. It's an exile festival. The Mishnah doesn't not crazy about that. So the Mishnah makes an attempt to connect as much as possible Purim or the Megillah to the land of Israel. Because when you talk about cities that have a wall around it, Yeshua ben Nun, the city that jumps out at you is the city of Jerusalem.
Are there other cities now?
Yes, there's a question. There's the question. The Gemara discusses other cities. One city it discusses is Tiberias, Tiberia. The city of Akko is another city. And the Gemara discusses what is obvious. What if you don't know? What do you do? It's like interesting Gemaras. There should be other cities. And it shouldn't be limited to Israel either. In fact, the Gemara at one point asked the question about Shushan. Was Shushan a city that had a wall from the time of Yeshua ben Nun? The Gemara thinks it probably didn't. So maybe Shushan should be that, which is crazy. So Shushan is different, but to that extent. But I was thinking something else relevant to our class here about Parsha Shavua. And there's something else very interesting about the Mishnah Masechet Megillah. This is my speculation. I'm not sure it's right, but it's interesting in any event. There's something else about the Mishnayot and Megillah that are very interesting. In fact, the way the Mishnah ends. The Mishnah ends, and these come up interspersed throughout the Mishnayot, discusses an interesting institution when it comes to reading the Torah, which is found in Masechet Megillah, in 2 or 3 different places, and that's how actually the Mishnayot end. The Mishnah raises the following. The Mishnah makes the following claim that when you read the Torah, not only do you read the Torah, but something comes along with reading the Torah, which the Mishnah calls Targum. You have to interpret the Torah. Targum is a translation. So it's clear that in the old days, when they read the Torah, somebody would actually translate as the reader goes along, maybe verse by verse, somebody would translate every word. We have printed in our Torah, in our Bibles, Targum Onkelos, for example. Targum Onkelos is one Targum. There were other Targumim as well, as is well known, but the one that became accepted by the Jewish people was what we call Targum, is the Targum of Onkelos. The Mishnah in the Masechet Megillah actually ends with a discussion about Targum, and the Mishnah makes the claim that some things that you read, you don't want to translate. Some things are read but not translated, because we don't want to understand exactly what we're saying. Some of those things are not so nice, so we don't, which then jumps off to another question about what things are read on which holidays, what things you don't read, all kinds of discussions. So I was thinking that first of all, why did the Mishnah Megillah, the emphasis on Targum is actually very interesting, because if there's any book of the Bible in which translation is essential, it's the scroll of Esther. Remember that when the letters are sent around in Megillah Esther, they're sent around to 127 provinces, and the Megillah says, every province according to its writing, every province according to its language. Actually, the Mishnah in Megillah talks about reading the Megillah in a different language. Can you read it? Can you read a Greek version to Greeks? Don't understand Hebrew. Can you read a Hebrew version to Greeks? Can you read it in Greek if it's written in Hebrew? These are questions that the Mishnah discusses. Yes, no, whatever. And I was thinking, all this will get to our Parsha, but this is actually a very interesting point about the Parashot in general. First of all, the Dalet Parashot are very interesting. But I was wondering something else about Targum, and that is, it strikes me that the idea of Targum, that is, what does Targum mean? It means I'm reading a sacred text, but I also have to explain it. It's built into the Torah reading. It strikes me there might be a model for this in the Torah itself, in the core Torah reading of the Torah, which is the following: Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Ketov zot zikaron b'sefer v'sim b'yoznei Yoshua. There you have exactly what we're talking about. God said, write this down, write it. It is as a remembrance, b'sefer, in a book, and then God added v'sim b'yoznei Yoshua, and speak it to Sim b'yoznei, put it in his ears, means speak it to Joshua. Doesn't matter if you read it to Joshua or you explain it to Joshua. Write it down in a book and make sure Joshua understands it. Which strikes me that we have here a good prototype for what we would call Targum. It strikes me the following: the tractate of Megillah ends with Targum. That's how the tractate ends. The tractate begins with Yoshua ben Nun. I'm wondering now if Yoshua ben Nun was chosen because not only is Yoshua the general who fights Amalek, he's also the ultimate student. Yoshua ben Nun is the ultimate Talmud of Moshe. And Moshe receives the Torah, as it says in Pirkei Avot, and passes it on to Yoshua. In passing it on to Yoshua, it can be passed on in writing or in speech. In the Torah, it's write it down in a book and speak it to Joshua. Symbiosne Yoshua, make sure Joshua understands it. So it strikes me as very interesting in terms of this thing we call Torah reading. So let's get to summarize where we stand at this point. That the claim I make is that the key Torah readings of the year are the ones that are right smack in the middle of now, the 4 exceptional Parshiyot. The second of which is obviously to be read before Purim, Amalek. And then we have last week's Parsha, which is Shkalim. I want to add something else now about Torah readings. Maybe we should have done this the first class. Who knows? Maybe we should have done it 35 years ago. But the point is to understand what the nature of Torah reading is. The Torah readings are interesting. The Mishnah mentions 2 interesting things about Torah readings. First of all, the obvious, you read from the Torah. You have selections from the Torah that you read, especially on the festivals, etc. You have a concept called Targum. You have to explain it. That's what the Mishnah says. You got to explain it. Nowadays, maybe there's less reason to explain things because nowadays people have Chumashim, which actually have translations. So we actually have translated Bibles for the most part. But in the time of the Mishnah, there was a person who actually would explain. And there, by the way, when I say would explain, there are different kinds of Targum. You understand? Some Targumim, for example, are typically translations. Targum Onkelos, more or less, every translation is an interpretation, but basically he's trying to translate the words. Other Targumim, Yonatan, for example, is much more embellished. He brings in Midrashim and stuff like that. There are 2 Targums on the Megillah, embellishments of the Megillah. Targum Sheni, there's the Targumim. These are not, in any event, and then there's something else. So there's reading the Torah, there's Targum, and there's another institution the Mishnah mentions. It's all in Masechet Megillah. It's so fascinating. What is the other institution? We take it for granted, actually. Together with the Torah reading, there's something else. Haftorah. The Haftarah. The Haftarah is connected to the Torah reading. What is the Haftarah? Right. So the Haftarah, as what we know of the Haftarot, are from the prophetic writings. We don't have any Haftarot from what's called the writings. The Tanakh is divided into 3 pieces. It's called Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Exactly what falls into which category, by the way, is not so clear. But in any event, that's how we divide it up. The Haftarot are, without exception, from the Nevi'im. We have no Haftarot from the Ketuvim. Tosfot claimed, the medievals claimed, that there was a time where Jews did have a Haftarah from the Ketuvim, and it would be recited Shabbos afternoon. Then it was abolished. But basically, that's what Tosfos claimed. But as we know it, they're from the Nevi'im. So the Mishnah says that not just you read the Torah, you also read the Nevi'im. I mentioned this in conjunction with last week's reading, which is Shabbat Shkalim. And there's a Shabbat Shkalim, and there's a Haftarah of Shkalim. And I wanted to raise the following question about the 4 Parshiyot. Let's take last week's, the second Parsha is Zachar. Obviously, you read it before Purim, because it talks about destroying Amalek. But what about last week's Torah reading? Last week's Torah reading is you read the section of the Torah that talks about counting the people. When you count the people, you shouldn't have a plague or some terrible thing happen when you count the people. This is what they should do, right? All those who are counted should donate a half shekel. Right? That's what it says. And no one should give more, no one should give less, right? To give this Terumah, it's called Terumat Hashem, L'chaper nafshotechem, to atone for your souls. That's what it says. It's very unclear. You read last week's Torah reading. Why is the atonement necessary for your souls? What is the atonement for? Why do you have to atone? That's the Torah reading. It's interesting, by the way, this half shekel, how does the Torah describe the half shekel? Chapter 30, what does it say?
That it's easy to pay.
No, the Torah doesn't say it's easy to pay. Some people it's very easy, some people may not be so easy. What is the word? Half a shekel. Hey, all right, fine, but what is it called? It's not a trick question. I actually want to point something out about it. The Torah calls this half shekel gift on page 180. Zeyinu kol ve'apkudim, machatzit shekel b'shekel hakodesh, verse number 13. Asrim geru shekel, machatzit shekel, Terumah Hashem. The Torah calls the half shekel, he uses the word Terumah in verse number 13, and it uses the same thing in verse number 14. It says, Terumah Hashem is in 13, Kol Avei Apkudim Yitain Terumat Hashem, and then in verse 15, Herashir lo yabeh vadau lo yamit machzit hashekel, latete Terumat Hashem, l'chaper nafshotechem. You have it 3 times. You have something 3 times, always, it's emphasis. So machzit hashekel is called the Terumah. That's very interesting, because that's how the Parsha of the Mishkan begins. This week's Parsha, right? This week's Parsha is called Terumah, right? It's called Terumah, right? In this week's Parsha, that's how one might say that these maybe are 2 bookends to the Mishkan. The first one, this week's Parsha talks about the Terumah. Who gives the Terumah in this week's Parsha? Who is dedicating things to the temple? V'yikluli Terumah, take from me a Terumah. So who's donating the Terumah? Which people? All the people? No, it doesn't say all the people. Anybody can do it. Yitain Terumat Hashem. Call in the Div Lev, it says. Any volunteer. It's voluntary. The donations to the Mishkan, with one exception, in the Torah are voluntary. There's no tax. You don't have to do it. If you desire to do it, you donate to the temple. That's how this week's Parsha begins. The exception to the rule, and it's called a Terumah. You take a Terumah from Israel, but call it Div Lev. Whoever is generous will volunteer. That's not true of the half shekel. The half shekel, you have no choice. Kol over hapkudim, whatever the age is and the gender, whatever it is, whoever does it is required to do it. Everybody, both rich and poor. And not only that, they can't actually give more. They're not allowed to give more. They only give the same half shekel. It's very curious. Not even a shekel. It's a half shekel. So the point is, one text I think illuminates the other. The emphasis in this week's Parsha on the voluntary gifts. The Mishkan is built with voluntary gifts. No one's forced. The half shekel, on the other hand, is mandatory. And it's an atonement. It atones for your souls. So now, why does it atone for your souls? Why does it atone for your souls? What's the pshat? We read it last week. Why? What is this about? What is the half shekel actually about? I'm talking about a plausible interpretation of the text. So, let me mention what Beno Jacob suggested, which I think is not correct, but I think it's interesting actually. He's pretty good, by the way. Beno Jacob, very important. I think his son or his grandson translated his works, and they published them. And I'm quite certain that the translation, I know, that the translation does not actually do justice to Beno Jacob. He's much better than that translation, because I've read his stuff quoted by other people. It's excellent. And the translation leaves a lot to be desired. So, but what Jacob suggests, I think he's the first one I saw it. It was a long time ago. that basically the people that have to donate the half shekel are people that go to war. Kol Overo Hapkudim, those are the ones eligible to fight. He suggested that the giving of the half shekel to atone for your souls is to atone for the fact that you're fighting a war, you're killing people. And that requires some, even if it's a justified war, nonetheless, it's taking life. So to atone for that, Jacob claimed, we have the donation of the half shekel. My gut tells me that it's not right. I don't think that's the pshat of it at all. It doesn't sound right to me. I mean, his idea is very sweet and all that, but it doesn't sound to me in the Chumash that that's what it's actually about. I think it's something else. I think it's a different point. Kol over hapkudim. The Torah says, doesn't say kol yotzei milchama, kol over hapkudim. This is last week's Torah reading. I'm thinking the following point. The Torah emphasizes the word pakad comes up here. Ki tisad rosh b'nei, page 180. The second verse of last week's Torah reading. Ki tisad rosh b'nei Yisrael v'fkudehem v'na'nu ish kofer nafsho Hashem b'fkodotam v'lo yeh b'hem negef b'fkodotam. You have a triple use of the word pakad in the very first verse there. Triples are for emphasis. When you are pokad, the people, you pokad them by giving the half shekel, and this half shekel will atone for their souls. What I was thinking is the following thought, and that is this idea of taking account, counting the people. That's what the Torah says. When you count the people, you are to give the half shekel. And I was thinking that, what is the idea of counting people? You see, what struck me was the verse in the book of Bamidbar. Book of Bamidbar begins with taking account. In fact, the book, we call it Bamidbar. But in the rabbinic thinking, which is ancient, and in the English translation, actually, it's not called the book of count, it's not called the book of desert. We've never heard the book called the desert. The name that we're familiar with, the fourth book of the Bible, is the book of Numbers. And the book of Numbers, actually, is a correct translation of the way our tradition sees Bamidbar. It's known in the rabbinic, in the tradition, ancient tradition, as Chomesh HaPekudim, the book of Pekudim, the book of numbering, the book of counting. That's in Jewish tradition. So the name Numbers, turns out, is a correct reflection of the Jewish name for the book. I mean, Bamidbar would be an early word in the book. We don't like to call a book a desert. You know what I mean? Desert. So we don't like desert, but it's known as Chomesh HaPekudim. And the reason it's called Chomesh HaPekudim, as the Netziv says in his introduction, because when you read the book of Numbers, you notice straight up that there are two main numberings of the people in the book of Numbers. There's the numbering in the beginning of the book, and the second numbering in chapter 26, which is the second generation. So the two numberings in Bamidbar, the numbers are virtually identical, by the way, but they're actually counting two different generations. The generation that leaves Egypt is the first numbers, and the second numbers of 26, Bamidbar, is the children of those that die in the desert, those that left Mitzrayim. What's interesting, though, is in the middle of the book of Numbers, there's a story, sad story, which gets us in deep trouble. It's called the episode of the Meraglim, the episode of the spies. In that story, after Israel sends their spies to spy out the land, or to scout out the land, and they come back with a report, it's a wonderful, great land for somebody else. We can't go there. We'll never conquer. They're too big, they're too strong. They see us as grasshoppers, we see ourselves as grasshoppers, or whatever. Take us back to Egypt. So God gets very angry, and the people want to go back to Egypt. God says to Moshe, let's get rid of these bums. I'll make you the people. Moshe says, you can't do that. Please don't do that. Don't lose your temper again. And Hashem, right? Erech HaPayim, there's a long-suffering God. So God responded to Moses in chapter 14 of the book of Numbers. I know this year is related to last week's Torah reading, but I want to make a simple point. The reason that we always do next week's Parsha is purely arbitrary. We could have always been doing last week's Parsha too. Can't wait. Those who make the rules can break the rules. That's there's no. In any event, so God said to Moshe, "Salachti kidvarecha," I forgive. However, all the people that left the land of Egypt are not going to go into the land of Canaan. So on page 315, and here's a verse that jumps out at you. So God says, tell the people the following. You didn't want to go into the land. A bunch of grasshoppers, whatever. You're not going to go into the land. Verse 29, page 315. Ba'midbar hazeh yiplu pigrechem v'chol pekudechem l'chol misparchem miben esrim shana v'mala asher halinotem olai. God said to Moses, in this very wilderness, your carcasses will drop. Of all of you who are recorded in your lists from the age of 20 years up, who have muttered against me. Notice the language there. Who's going to die in the desert? It says, L'chol pekudechem. Pekudechem, our word. All those who were taken stock of. L'chol misparchem, according to the numbers of 20 years and up. It's exactly the last week's Torah reading, right? All those that are counted from 20 years and up shall give this offering unto God. Everyone must give the same. So notice, it's interesting that there it talks about who's going to die in the desert. All those that were counted from 20 years and up shall die in the desert. Your carcasses will die in the desert, and your children that you thought they're the ones who will go farther. So what is the relevance of all this? So here's what I was thinking about last week's Torah reading, and not just about the Torah reading, in general. What does it mean to be counted? There are different words for counting, but one of the key words in the last week's Torah reading and the key word in Bamidbar is the Hebrew word pakad. Pakad has a variety of meanings in the Torah. Hashem pakadet sarah kasher amar. So pakad, one definition of pakad is to remember. To remember. To remember, you usually have the word zachar, to be zocher. Parshat Zachar, actually, is the second parsha. The first parsha, though, is the parsha of Machzit HaShekel. I would say the first parsha is Parshat Pakod, actually. The second is Parshat Zachar. It's actually interesting in its own right. Here's what I'm thinking about counting. And the English also picks this up. When you are counted, okay, the word pakad has another meaning. For example, the Levium in the book of Bamidbar are counted separately. Torah makes a big fuss about counting the Levium separately. Why are the Levium counted separately? They counted separately in the first census, and they counted separately in the second census. Curious is that only in the second census is the following reason given. In the second census, it says count them separately because the census was for those people that will get land. When you enter into the land, you possess land. But the Levium don't have their own land. The Levium are given land by the tribes. They don't possess their own land. So therefore, they're to be counted separately. That is what it says in chapter 26 of Bamidbar. But it never says a word about that in the beginning of Bamidbar, where it makes even a stronger point. Achad matei Levi lo tifkod. Do not count the Levium with the others. But it says nothing about land. It says something different about the Levium. V'yata hafked al Leviim. It says rather, the Levium are not to be counted separately. Pakod, don't count them with the others, but rather hafked al Leviim, give them hafked. In Hebrew, we say the word tafkid. What's a tafkid in Hebrew? An assignment, a job. A tafkid, you have an assignment. The Levium have a different assignment. They're to guard the holy places. And therefore, because they have a different tafkid, they are counted separately. So the counting of you is related to your task. In other words, when you get counted, you become, we would say in English, you become accountable. The English picks it up beautifully. You are accountable. It's a very important lesson for all of us, I think. terms of something I've been involved in for many years, which I call it the feminist movement. I don't know what you want to call it. One of the points I make, usually just when women are in the room, but Phil was here, but doesn't matter. He's a friend. If you want to be counted, okay, I believe that women should always be counted. And you have to understand that you're also accountable. That those two things go together. If you want to be responsible, if you want to be a full member of society, then you have to take on the responsibilities of society. You can't have it both ways. You know what I mean? It's a package deal. And that's what the Chumash says about being counted. And for this reason, you see, being counted is a very dangerous thing. That's what you see in Sefer Bamidbar. If you're not counted, okay, stand on the side. A lot of people like that. They don't want to be counted. Stand on the sidelines. They watch from the outside. That's great. But if you want to actually be counted, you want to be considered that you're part of it, part of something, part of this community or whatever, it's dangerous. Because the moment God counts you, you become accountable. The counting is a very dangerous thing. That's what you see in Bamidbar. Who's going to die in the desert? You're going to drop. God is very angry. Your carcasses you'll all drop dead in the desert. Which ones will drop dead? The ones I counted from 20 years and up. The word pakad, actually, and pakad has another meaning in the Chumash, which is when the Torah speaks in the Ten Commandments, we read it. Poked avon avot al banim, who visits the sins of the parents upon the children. Poked avon means God is remembering, God is punishing. Poked has an aspect, unlike Zochar. Zochar doesn't have that aspect to it. In the biblical Hebrew, Zochar is typically much more positive term. Pakad is Zochar, but Pakad has typically another side to it. Another side to it. I would say even Hashem Pakadet Sarah Kasher Amar, God remembered Sarah, but God remembered a lot of things about Sarah. God remembered that Sarah, suffered in Egypt, that's for sure. Maybe God remembers that Sarah abused her slave. Maybe God remembers that when Sarah was told she's having a baby, she laughed in disbelief. All those things God is remembering. So Hashem Pokadet Sarah Kasher Amar, God remembered Sarah. That's in chapter 21. But in chapter 22, a little beloved child is walking towards the mountain to be immolated in a sacrifice. We don't know what Sarah knew and doesn't know, but we know the situation. And that is, so Hashem Pokadet. Interesting is something else, by the way. I'm just thinking now. The Gemara says that on Rosh Hashanah, what is Rosh Hashanah called, by the way, in our liturgy? What do we call Rosh Hashanah in our prayers? Yom HaZikaron. Rosh Hashanah is called in the prayer service the Day of Remembrance. The Gemara says, and the middle section of Rosh Hashanah is called Zichronot. Zichronot. The Gemara says, actually, it's interesting. When you pray on Rosh Hashanah, Zichronot, I'm telling you things that are so basic here, by the way. I mean, it's so core. The Gemara says on Rosh Hashanah, that on Rosh Hashanah, when we are praying, we are to cite verses from the Bible. The Gemara says. The Rosh Hashanah prayer service, essentially, is based on scripture. It's based on the citation of biblical verses. The verses in Zichronot should have the word Zachar in it. The word Zachar should be there. The Gemara says, what about the word Pakad? Suppose you want to cite a biblical verse, doesn't have the word Zachar, has the word Pakad. The Gemara says that's okay. Pikdonot harehem kezichronot. Fine. You can use one or the other. You have a choice. Here's the interesting thing. In our service of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish people's service of Rosh Hashanah, we have 10 verses from the Bible. All 10 have the word Zachar. None have the word Pakad. It's interesting. The Torah reading is Hashem Pakad et Sarah. But our service, our prayers, don't mention Pakad. All of the Zichronot verses, the 10 of them, have only the word Zachar and not the word Pakad. I don't think it's an accident. Because the word Pakad, which is very appropriate for Rosh Hashanah, means that we stand before God and we are counted. The poet said it very well. Kivakorat roeh edro, the Ashkenazim say, as a shepherd counts his flock, Mavir Sono Tachat Shifto. King Timne V'Tismor V'Tifkod, right? Counting each one of them. Tachto Kitzvul Chorbiyotecha. The son of Tokef. As the shepherd counts each one. It's actually a terrific image of the shepherd counting each one, or as God counting each one. Because it carries with it two different meanings over there, of God counting each one. One meaning is, son of Tokef, who's going to live and who's going to die. And that's what the son of Tokef says. Each one is counted, each one to his or her own destiny. Being counted this year. Who knows if next year we're going to be there? Look around. Some people aren't here. That's the idea of counting each one. Then there's another sense of kivakaras, of counting each one, that the shepherd counts the flock. The shepherd cares about each one. Make sure that, want to make sure that each one of the sheep is coming back, And you're not sure about one. Maybe someone wandered off a few times. You don't know if that one's still going to be with us or not. So the shepherd is very, where's Elsie today? Is Elsie here? Maybe Elsie was missing. So they're counting each one. The one who picks this up, by the way, I'll tell you something. I don't know if it's conscious or not. Shlomo Carlebach wrote a tune for Kvakoras. And it's one of the probably the best thing he ever wrote, actually. If you're familiar with it, it has two parts. It's actually a very brilliant tune. The first part is more of a chazanish, kind of more, there's a frightening side to it, a little pathos to it, frightening side. He sings it first that way. And the second time he sings it again the other way, with the tune, Kivakaras. We at Risha, we sing this tune, and the part before that. That's how it starts, right? And he picked up exactly the two sides of the counting. We don't use pakad in our prayers. The core prayer of Rosh Hashanah, which is the psukim, because even though it's true that it's a day of judgment, so it's a day, right? God is pokad, right? Atozocher ma'aseh olam ufoked kol yitzur eket. That's how we start. But yet, in our service of Rosh Hashanah, we don't want the core text. We don't want the word pakad. We prefer the God remembering. Ki zocher kol nishkachot atahu me'olam v'ein shechacha v'nei kisei chavadecha v'akedat Yitzchak hayom u'zaro b'rachamim tizkar. What a service it is! It's just majestic, really, and the language is very beautiful. Hebrew is amazing. So we talk about God remembering. God, you remembered. You remember the people. You remember the binding of Isaac. You have it in our merit. So that's zachar. But pakad has a different meaning. And that's, I think, what last week's pshat is. The way the counting itself puts you in danger. So therefore, within the counting itself, the way you are counted, you should dedicate it to the temple. You should dedicate the half shekel to the temple, because the temple is the place where we bring the sacrifices of atonement, and the machzit hashekel is going to function as a kind of atonement. And the reason, I think, is because I count you via the temple. The temple itself is a place of mercies, as God describes it. Ultimately, it's a place of God's name. Merciful God is in the temple. So make sure that when you get counted via the temple. I don't think it has to do with going to war at all. It has to do with something very basic about counting. Last week's Parsha was Parsha Shkolim, actually. And I do think, on some level, just before you comment, that this also is a Purim connection, actually. Now, the Gemara already connects it to Purim. On one level, it's connected to Purim, and I think on two levels, it's connected to Purim. Let me make the following observation about Parsha Shkolim. First of all, it's connected to Purim. There is a very interesting custom that the Jewish people have, and I'll take your comment in 1 second. There's a very, I would say, curious custom that the Jewish people have, unusual custom, surprising custom. The Machzit HaShekel coins, according to the Mishnah, there's a tractate called Masechet Shkolim, by the way, a little tractate called Masechet Shkolim. Most people don't study it. It's there. If you do the Daf Yomi, you get there. So shkolim, the shekels were collected every year on the month of Adar, during Adar, before Nisan. And they were used to buy the communal sacrifices. That's what the Mishnah says. The coins were collected in the desert. They were collected, and they were used to make the things that fasten the temple to the ground. But in the Mishnah, it talks about collecting the coins to bring the communal sacrifices. So Parsha Shkolim can be understood. This was the time when we used to announce that it's time to give your money to help for the sacrifices. So we have the custom to read the Torah reading, Parsha Shkolim, in the beginning of the month of Adar. It's a bit odd, since we have no communal sacrifices and we have no temple, that we would still, follow this custom. And if this is the origination of the custom, it means it probably existed even at the time the temple was up, which is very old. What do you want to say, Phil?
Well, I think about something you said years ago.
Yes.
In health class, we talked about the sin of David, and the sin of David being counting and taking the census. And that when you take the census, you're saying people belong to you.
Yes.
And I was thinking of the idea of everyone having to give the half shekel as kind of all being part, all belonging to God, and that we're counted because we have now become, it's becoming God's people.
Right. Right, which is related to what I'm saying now. That is true, but it's also related to, that's part of why it's dangerous. In other words, the danger is if you enter into a covenantal relationship with anyone, and especially God, it means you become accountable to God. It means if you violate the covenant, there are all kinds of dire consequences. So the idea of being counted then, I totally agree with that. It has to do with being counted into. One might say you're counted in. It's like nowadays you might sign a contract. So in those days you counted. Being counted is like signing a contract, and the reason it's so dangerous is because once you're in, either you're in or out. If you're out, okay. But if you're in, then you're fully in. You can't be halfway. So the point is, then it imposes on us all kinds of obligations. That's the first point. Yeah.
Even today, if you sign a contract and there's no money given, the contract is not valid. Something has to be given.
Usually, that's right. Usually there's some kind of a deposit at the same time.
Yeah,
Whether technically it's valid or not, it depends on the laws of that place, but it's true. The point, the contract is binding. The point is, once you close the deal, that's it. It's closed either with a contract, with deposit, it goes with a handshake in some places, whatever it is. So that's the let me get back to the shkolim now. So I'm trying to get my train of thought back now, 1 second. Yes, so that's one possibility, that the reading of the Parsha Shkolim is a remembrance. In the old days, in the first day of Adar, they would announce that time to pay your shkolim. That strikes me as very odd, given our circumstances. We have no shkolim, we have no temple. The Gemara connects it to something else. In other words, I have no doubt maybe at some time that was the reason for it, but that reason is lost on us. There must be something else over here. The Gemara in Megillah actually tied the shkolim to something else. The Gemara said, you should give your shekels, give your shekels in the beginning of the month of Adar, so that your shekels should precede the shekels that Haman wanted to collect to destroy you. Remember in the Megillah, Haman goes to the king, and he says to the king, there's a bunch of people out there, Mefuzar u'meforad, scattered and dispersed throughout your kingdom. And Haman says, if it please the king, let's write down that they should be destroyed. And then he added, Vaseret alofim ki karkesef eshkol al yedei osei hamlacha uyavi el genzei hamelech, and I will donate, says Haman, 10,000 kikar kesef, talents of kesef. It's an astronomical sum of money, by the way. Someone said in modern day dollars, it's in the trillions, actually. It's bigger than the GNP of most countries. I mean, the Megillah is filled with these embellishments or exaggerations. But that would be and so I will be shokel, says Haman, aseret alafim kikar kesef. So Those are the shekels. And the king says to Haman, very interesting, what does the king say to Haman? Haman, hakesef natun lach. The money is yours, and the people to do whatever you want. What does that mean, hakesef natun lach? It's a big mystery, actually. I mean, the money is yours. What does it mean? Haman says to the king, I want to kill these people. He doesn't say what they are, but a bunch of people, bad guys. I'll give you $1 trillion. $1 trillion to bring into the king's treasuries. The king says the money is yours. Do whatever you want, the money is. What does it mean the money is yours? Never mind? Is that what it means? Some think it means never mind. Most people think it means dumb. $1 trillion or dumb. Is that what it means? Never mind? King says to forget the money. Later on, by the way, in the Megillah, when Mordechai wants Esther to save the Jews, he shows her the decree, and he tells her that Haman, Asher Amar Haman Lishkol, about the money that Haman had spoken to gather or to donate to the treasuries. From that verse, it doesn't sound like the king said to Haman, forget about it. So what does it mean the money is yours? I mean, the money is yours. So some say, the king says, forget about it. Some say the king says, the money's, you have to give the money's not important, but he never actually said you have to give it. It's not about the money. But he takes the money. That's also very odd. I'm not talking about a small amount of money over here. I'm talking about trillions of dollars. I'm talking about, I have a different shot, right?
The money is your responsibility. I mean, that money has to come from somewhere.
Natun lach, though, it's given to you, though. It wasn't given to you. What does natun mean? Natun means it's given to you. Never bother everybody here? You read the Megillah every year, actually twice a year. What does it mean the money is yours? What does it mean it's given to you? He's actually giving him the money, he says forget about it? Doesn't sound that way. Oh no, Haman, no. Then the deal's off. First, when you speak to the king, you making a commitment. I think it means something else, actually. I think it means something else. I think what Haman is saying is, Haman wants to kill all the Jews. But what he says is, I will donate the money to the treasuries. I think what he's saying is, I'll give $1 trillion to the treasuries. From that money, right? That money will be used to kill the Jews. In other words, what Haman wants is not you just have a bunch of marauders running around the country, killing Jews. He wants it to go through the channels of the king. He wants the monies, the payment, it's going to pay people. He wants to get an army by paying money. When you get your check in the mail, it says U.S. Treasury on it. It doesn't say Haman's private account. Haman and Zeresh joint account. It doesn't say that. It says U.S. Treasury. The king says the money is yours. Now, by implication, I think that somebody will stay in the treasury, so the king will benefit. But fundamentally, what Haman is saying, which makes it very dangerous, I don't want this to be a private thing. That's why he goes to the king. That's just to get permission. He wants the king to do. If this is correct, the king is really a full partner in this enterprise. He's not just whether he knows or doesn't know. It's a separate question. That's what I believe it is. In any event, let's get back to last week's Torah reading of Parsha Shkolim. Here's what struck me about the Torah reading of Parsha Shkolim. And I want to make one last point about this. Not so much the Torah reading of last week, but the Haftorah. The Haftorah is extremely interesting. Remember that the Torah reading has two pieces to it. There's the Torah reading in the Mishnah and the Haftorah. And the Mishnah says what Haftorah you read on last week's Parsha. The Haftorah is the story of Yehoyada HaKohen. Let's find this. Where is this over here? Where is this? It's Malachim. It's got to be in Malachim. Oh, where is this? I believe it's after. Anybody know where it is? Let's find it quickly. Let's see. Here it is. Page 802. Actually 804. Page 804, chapter 12, last week's Haftorah. Parsha Shkolim. Let's start on the bottom of 804. Let's start with Vayoma Yoash. King Yoash said to the priests, all the money that is brought, I'll read the English, all the money, current money, brought into the house of God as sacred donations, Kesef Nafshot Erko, all the money that was that one considered to give to bring to the house of God, let the priests receive the money from their benefactors, and in turn, let them make repairs on the house, on the temple, whatever damage may be found. Apparently, the temple is fallen into disrepair. So Yoash wants the priests to fix up the temple, and they're getting money from their buddies, from their friends. Use that money to fix up the temple. And it came to pass on the 23rd year, but the priests had not made repairs on the house. So they took the money, but they weren't repairing it, right? So the king called the high priest, Yoyada. He said to them, listen, how come you're not fixing out that? Stop taking money from your buddies. Let the money go to fix up the house. So the priests agreed with that. Fine. The priests agreed they wouldn't accept money from the people, nor make repairs on the house. They said, listen, okay, we don't take the money, we'll leave it. So leave that money out. So where's the money going to come from? So now we have the invention of the pushka. This is an invention over here. He took a patent on it. I don't know if he took a patent on that. But anyway, priest Yehoyada took a chest. He made a hole in the lid. He placed it on the right side of the altar, right? The priestly guards of the threshold deposited all the money that was brought into the house. When it was full, the chest was full, the priest and the scribe put the money in the house of God into bags. They would count it. Deliver the money that was weighed out to the overseers of the work, who were in charge of the house of God. These in turn used to pay the carpenters, the laborers, worked on the house of God, the masons, the stone cutters, the wood, the quarried stone, etc., etc. However, no silver bowls, no snuffers, basins, or trumpets were made at the house of God from the money brought into the house. They were given to the overseers, etc. No check was kept on the men. They dealt honestly. Money that was brought as a guilt offering was not deposited. It went to the priests. This is the Haftorah of last week, Parsha Shkolim. Here's what's interesting about the Haftorah. Actually, several things. Here's one of them. This describes the people that work in the temple and describes how they collected money to strengthen the house. The house is in disrepair. What's curious is that two different kinds of people are described. Apart from the high priest Yehoyada, two different kinds of people are described as working in this house. One is keepers of the threshold, which in the Hebrew is Shomrei Hasaf. That's found in verse number 10. They should give it to the priests who are the keepers of the threshold, or the money that is brought into the house. And then, when they have all the counted money, they should give the money al yedei osei hamlacha, those who are the overseers of the work. And what's curious is that Shomrei Hasaf and Osei Hamlacha figure prominently in the Megillah. It's the Shomrei Hasaf in the Megillah, Bigtan and Teresh, who try to kill the king. It's the Osei Hamlacha that Haman says right after that, let me give the money, right, the next chapter, let me give you 10,000 talents of silver, and I will bring it into the king's treasuries, al yedei osei hamlacha, through those that do the work. It's not clear what the work means over there. Later in the Megillah, the same thing. Later, when the second letter goes out to fight with the Jews, the osei hamlacha are promoting the Jewish cause because they're afraid of Mordechai. And what struck me something very interesting about the Haftorah of Parsha Shkolim and the Megillah. The Megillah actually presents us with a king of the world, and he has many spaces in his kingdom. I might say palaces in his kingdom. He has those who serve him. He has avodim. He has shomrim, who guard the women, guard the concubines, guard the threshold. He has special places with special rules. You can't just walk in there. You'll be killed without being called. No mourning is allowed. You can't walk into a sackcloth. You have Osei HaMelacha. In short, the world of Achashverosh and the palaces of Achashverosh are described in the Megillah in precisely the language that the Bible describes God's spaces, God's temple. God has Osei Melacha, God has Shomerei Asaf, God has rules about entrance. You can't just walk in, lest you be killed, to the Holy of Holies, to the inner chamber. Yayin v'sheichar, you can't drink in the temple. You can't mourn in the temple. That basically the Megillah describes a world in which God's Mishkan has morphed into Achashverosh's palace. And in this world, you have Haman deciding to give his shekels. He's going to support Achashverosh. If Achashverosh does his work, allows him to kill the Jews, he's going to give his shekels. Now the shekels, of course, of Haman and the shekels of the Torah are very different. The shekels of the Torah are no rich man can give more, no poor man can give less. You give not even a whole shekel, you give a half shekel. Everybody's incomplete, as it were. The shekels of Haman are, I'll give you $1 trillion. That's his shekels. It's Haman. And I think perhaps, coming back to the way we started the shir this morning, perhaps there is a sense within our tradition, the rabbinic tradition, that sees it's a description of the temple is here to, one might say, to counter, as it were, or to remind us of what is the true temple. We live in a world of Achashverosh. We live in a world of the palaces are the palaces of Achashverosh, the temples of Achashverosh. The advisor is Haman. The money dictates, and that's what the Megillah is about. How do you survive in such a world? And the Haftorah actually is reminding us before you get to Purim, and even though the world in which we live may be the world of Purim, that's quite possible. It's the world of Achashverosh, but we have to still remind ourselves there is another world. There's a different world. Maybe it's an imaginary world, but maybe it's a world to which we aspire to, I would say. And that's exactly the Haftorah, which is all the languages of the Megillah. The Shomerei Asaf. This is about straightening the Mishkan through the donations. The donations, not of the people who are known to anybody. Actually, the donations are made anonymously. The pushka, that's the point. You come in and drop your coins. No one knows who you are. No one knows who gave the money. It's not about me donating. No, nobody has a clue. And that you don't take from your friends. That's the point. You take from the people generally, which of course at its core is the idea of the Machzir HaShekel. That it's, Haman had said, what do I say? These people are scattered and dispersed. And the idea of the Machzir HaShekel, that's what the Gemara means, is to create in us a sense of responsibility, of kind of communal responsibility for ourselves and for the larger community. And that's the idea of the half shekel. So my point about the Arba Parshiot is that the claim here, true or not, I think it's true, is that not only is Parshat Zachar very much a Purim connection, but Shkolim as well. And we have a very strange custom of the Jewish people. And on the night of Purim, before we read the Megillah, there's an ancient custom. It's found in the 13th century, tested to in the 13th century. Maybe many have seen it, to give half shekels before you read the Megillah. Has anybody seen that custom? No one has seen the custom of giving half shekels? Yes, you've seen it. You go, even they have plates of coins out, and you give 3 half shekels. You take some they have half 50-cent pieces, and you take it. You give it down. You give it back again. The Machzir HaShekel, it's so strange. Because why would you give it? Why are you giving it before you read the Megillah? That's the custom, to give the Machzir HaShekel dafka before you read the Megillah. It's actually the Shulchan Aruch quotes it. It's from the Ramah. That's exactly the point, that the tradition, the customary tradition, sees the connection between Purim on one hand and Parsha Shkolim on the other. Speaking of responsibility, I want to remind everybody, tomorrow night, we have a fellow named Mark Winnie who's speaking here at Drisha. He's a fellow from New Mexico. He's one of the leading people in the United States on the systemic problems of food injustice and food insecurity in the United States. He's not known in the Jewish community at all. And the issue he talks about is not specific to the Jewish community. But I think it's very important. We do many things at Drisha. I urge everybody to come to it and bring some people to it as well. I like people to show up to this. I think it's very important. It's tomorrow night. He speaks at 7:45. Mark Winnie, W-I-N-N-E. You can Google him, you'll see. W-I-N-N-E. He's very well known. He's written a couple of books. And I think we're trying to understand the systemic issues of hunger. Many people think there is no problem in this country of hunger, but it happens to be false. There is a problem, actually, for many, many people. Okay, we'll stop. All right.